Thank you, guys. I'm always honored when you invite me to speak. I'm so glad that you're willing to have me. Let me know if you can hear, if this is working in the right place. And I decided that something that might be interesting to people who are interested in the intersection of faith and science is the way scientific ideas can be applied to the study of religion itself. And I know that comes with some danger because it's usually associated with the argument about whether religion is true or right or whether we should be religious. And that has nothing to do with kind of what I want to talk about, which is religion is something people do, right? And so can we apply the scientific method to studying what people do? Well, we do that all the time. It's called sociology, anthropology. And so can we point that at religion as one of the many things people do? And when we do that, what insights do we come up with? So it makes sense to me to start with just a discussion of what science is, and that's probably a controversial point, especially for scientists. But I'm what I call a religious Bayesian, so I'm going to tell you what science is to me. From my perspective, science is the application of Bayes' law, and everything else is a heuristic. Bayes' law has an equal sign in it, so it's true and it's right, and that's the answer. The problem, of course, is that it's also intractable and none of us can do it, so we approximate it. And so the scientific method is just a way of approximating what Bayes' law says we're supposed to be doing, which is updating our theories in the presence of observations. You can also, if you mix this with utility theory, you can also calculate things like the expected value of sample information, which is just a fancy statistical way of deciding what experiment you should do next, namely the one that will change your theory, or that is most likely to change your theory in a way that is most likely to update your behavior. Is kind of what that tells you. And out of that falls all the stuff we talk about in science, like falsifiability. Falsifiability doesn't matter. It's not anywhere in Bayes' law. On the other hand, things that aren't falsifiable have no impact on your utility. So my point is, some of these heuristics that we believe are part of science, I believe, just kind of fall out of the statistics. This is the result of getting a PhD in statistical machine learning. I apologize. So how do we use this for studying? It's obvious when I talk about fundamental physics, like rolling balls, like Galileo, we're rolling balls down inclines. We can all repeat those experiments. We understand how to apply the scientific method to that. What happens when I try to study something more transient that I can't repeat, like a hurricane? Well, there's still ways you can do it. You can still study their causes, the mechanisms. You can make predictions about when you can't make predictions about individual hurricanes, specifically that there will be a hurricane on this day at this time, but you can do broad statistics about hurricanes will increase as the water temperature increases. That's a hypothesis. You can study the historical development of hurricanes, compare it to things like water temperatures, human effects, etc. So there's stuff you can do with the scientific method to answer questions about hurricanes, and that's not controversial. But what happens if I apply that to something like marriage, a human institution? We call these soft sciences, and we do it for a reason. It's because we can't repeat the experiment. Humans are involved, so telling humans information about our theories will impact their behavior. And so it's harder, but there are still things you can do, right? You can look at the historical development. You can look back in time, and you can ask questions like, what was marriage like many years ago? What is marriage like today? Who's allowed to get married? How old do they have to be? What legal implications and what role does the state play? There are historical questions you can ask. There's also causal questions you can ask, like what happens to people's finances when they're married? What happens to their happiness? What happens to their life expectancy? So we can apply science to marriage. Well, if we can do that, can we apply it to religion? And if we do, what sort of questions can we ask, and what sort of questions can't we ask? I'm going to start from the very beginning and say I don't think we can answer questions like, does God exist? Or should you be religious? or even necessarily maybe what church should you belong to. Those are theological questions that I'm not here to debate. In fact, I find the argument about whether God exists fairly tiring, which is why I self-identify as agnostic. I don't particularly care in many ways, but I do care about religious institutions, their impact on society. I care about, well, not just do I care about, but there's things we can determine about them using the scientific method. And there's even some things we can ask that have theological import. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but one of the things you could do is you could look at some claims that religious texts make. If they make historical testable claims, we can maybe answer questions about those. But again, I don't think that has bearing on whether we should be religious. It might have bearing on whether we should be a fundamentalist. So one of the things I've often said is science disproves fundamentalism. It doesn't disprove religion itself. But we can say things like, the flood didn't happen when the Bible says it did, and it didn't cover the whole earth. And the reason I know that is because I've stood in Teddy's tomb. By the way, Teddy was Pharaoh when the flood was supposed to happen. And I looked at the writing on the wall, and I asked the question, who buried this guy? And where did he come from? Clearly, there's some tension there. That tension has created a sense that religious studies or historical archaeology or any of that stuff is antithetical to religious belief. And my claim is that it's antithetical, again, to fundamentalist religious belief. It is not antithetical to religious belief itself, and there's many ways to be religious in ways that are not in conflict in any way. Okay, so what is religious studies? Well, and where did it grow from? So there are different, when we start talking about religion, when the intelligentsia, right, they get up and they start chatting about religion, there's a couple things they might be doing. If they're in a debate about the Trinity, or not debate, let's say they're talking about the Trinity and pointing out theological applications of, is Jesus fully man and fully God, and what does it mean to be fully man? They're doing theology. What's the difference? Theology is when you're speaking to a religious group or between several religious groups about a specific religious doctrinal question, and it's for the insiders usually, or between two groups that are discussing a difference of theological opinion. Apologetics is also a little bit different. Apologetics is usually when you stand in one religion and you defend it from defend its beliefs to outsiders. And there is a long history going back in Christianity all the way, to the early days of the church, to Paul, Augustine, of theology and apologetics. It's a common thing, but it goes back much further. We see it in Greek texts, we see it in biblical texts. And so theology and apologetics is something that's been around forever. Hermeneutics is a little bit different, but it's about understanding a text. So hermeneutics might be about trying to figure out what a text means, and we might even use scientific tools to determine what a text means. Religious studies is different from all of these in a subtle way. And what it is when you, again, apply scientific principles to the study of religion, not for the purposes of making a theological point, but for the purposes of understanding the religion, culturally, economically, etc. And it grew out of these other things. And it grew slowly. We moved in Christianity in the West, from theology into the religious studies during the wars of religion. Right, in the 1600s, it became clear after the Protestant Reformation that there was going to be some diversity that was going to last, and that we weren't going to settle that diversity by killing each other. And we had to find a way to talk to each other. And thus, groups of various religions, like the ones here today, get together and we chat and we try to make sure we can all get along. Very, very important, good thing. But that also changed the intelligentsia from doing only theology. It didn't stop theology, but it moved them from doing just theology into a realm where they're starting to discuss other religions. The other thing that happened was a whole bunch of ethnographic data started coming in from tribes in Australia and from around the world, from Asia, from Africa. And people realized that religion was very diverse, and there was this whole set of religious practices that are unlike anything Christians had thought about, and they needed a way to understand it. And so they started sending people out to do observational research And these people would wander into these tribes, and they would often forget, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle rule, which is their presence began to change the tribes they were studying, and they didn't realize that. But nevertheless, they would go and they would sit there, and usually men, so they had no access to the women of the tribe, which caused all sorts of problems and limitations in their data. But nevertheless, they were gathering data in a scientific way, or trying to. And this was all influenced, of course, by the Enlightenment. So all these things, the Enlightenment, the new ethnographic data, and the diversity of religious beliefs, all led to the move from theology into religious studies. Religious studies has what we call, one of the principles of religious studies that differentiate it from theology, let's say it that way, is what we call methodological atheism. And what we mean by that is not that you have to be an atheist to do religious studies. What we mean is we're going to set aside the question of whether God is real, and it's not that you don't have to believe it. Many people in religious studies are deeply religious. Many people are not. But we're going to set that question aside, and we're just going to ask other questions that we can maybe answer with the scientific method, since we can't answer that one. If you go into a religious studies department in a college in the US today, what you will find is that it is less a discipline. History has a specific discipline with specific rules kind of for how you do history, techniques. But if you go to religious studies, there is no religious studies discipline. What you find is people from various disciplines applying their techniques to the topic of religion. So religious studies is an interdisciplinary skill or group where they all apply their studies to a specific topic. And it's the topic that makes it religious studies rather than something else studies. It's not the technique. And so you'll find anthropologists, sociologists, textual criticists, political scientists, archaeologists, even evolutionary biologists getting together and chatting about religion. Now, for me, it was a computer scientist who was wandering into a religion department, in theory, helping them do statistical analysis on old Syriac texts, religious Syriac texts. And so this is how people from other kind of disciplines provide insight, presumably, into religious studies. Okay, so now if we're going to do that, if what makes it religious studies is the topic, it would be really helpful if we could define the topic. The problem is the only thing that scholars of religious studies agree on is that there is no agreed consensus definition of religion. And that's a problem. We don't even know what we're studying, right? It's a problem. And the reason we don't know is that any rule you create, you give me a definition of religion, I will give you a group that most people think is religious or most people think is not religious, that either meets your definition and shouldn't, or doesn't meet your definition and should. Unless your definition is like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography, which is I know it when I see it. I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. You can do something like that, but that's the issue. We have an intuitive definition of religion, but we don't have a formal definition. And every formal definition you create, there is some exception. Unitarian Universalists, my own church, is a great example. We Trump just took us off the list of accepted religions because we don't know if we're a religion or a social club, right? I mean, we don't know what we are. Freemasonry insists it is not a religion, but almost any definition of religion that you posit, Freemasonry is a religion. The reason they insist they're not a religion is because they want to be a social club that invites people from many different religions into their social club. So they have a reason to want to not be defined as a religion, but they match most of our sociological definitions of religion very, very well. Political parties and sports, we don't think of those as religions, but again, most religious definitions would easily include them, but feel like they shouldn't. The reason this is so hard, or at least one of the reasons it's so hard, is that the concept of religion is actually a really recent Western concept. And I know that feels weird. When I say that, most people kind of go, are you sure? I mean, I've seen the term religion in ancient, texts. People talked about religion forever. What do you mean by that? Well, most languages don't have a term for religion that matches to the English. which of course means they don't have religious studies. They don't have a word for religion. If you go to China and you ask people, what religion are you? They look at you like you're crazy and say, I don't believe in superstition, because the word for religion is superstition. If you then ask them what they do, they're happily describe Buddhism, Confucianism, or whatever the heck it is, but they're not religious. It really messes up survey data, by the way. Because you ask them, what religion are you? And they always mark none, and then you ask them questions about what they do, and it's very clear they're a Buddhist. So what's happened here is that if you ask about religion in for example, Latin, in the early Catholic, to be religious meant to join a religious order. The term religion existed, but it had to do with churches, cathedrals, and the institution. It had nothing to do with belonging to a denomination or a specific religion. They had ways of talking about Christianity versus Islam, but that's not what religion meant. What religion are you? What really happened was that the Enlightenment created secularism, and secularism created religion as a defined category. They didn't differentiate between the secular and the profane, between the religious and the non-religious, because everything just was. Religion was one of the many things they did, and they didn't differentiate between the religious and the non-religious parts. So when we talk about religious studies, we say we're going to study the religious part as opposed to the secular part. And it's not clear, first of all, that distinction is arbitrary and is fuzzy and was invented by the Enlightenment. And when we study religion, we're often studying things that predate the Enlightenment or that come from other cultures that didn't experience the Enlightenment in the same way. And so, again, the very term itself is hard to define, and that's why it's so hard to define, is that it's a very recent Western term. And it's not because we invented religion, it's because we invented secularism, and therefore religion took on a meaning as opposed to secularism, the sacred versus the profane. This is a great book, by the way, if you're interested in that topic. How religion was created and what it means, and what that means for religious studies specifically. The implications are broad and profound. I'm going to skip this quote. It's interesting, but it basically says what I just said to you. So what I'm going to do now, and I would much rather talk about individual scientific hypotheses and how we can test them, and the modern stuff that's most interesting. But most classes in religious studies start with the history. So we're going to kind of do that too. I'm going to show you how religion was defined and the hypotheses that created about a religion from the past. And most of them are disproved. Most of them are wrong, very clearly wrong. And so it feels like we're not making any progress. But on the other hand, that's how science works, right? We propose hypotheses, and then we disprove them, and then we move forward. And so what we're going to kind of do is do a roller coaster ride through some of the past theories about religion and where they came from. The first is David Hume. David Hume is kind of my hero. I like the guy a lot. One of my favorite statements from him prefaces Bayesian theory, where he says, there are utilitarian theory, which says you can't define ought from is, meaning you can't figure out what ought to be just from what is. What ought to be is a bunch of moving atoms. What is a preference in your own mind, and they have to come from different states. It's very profound stuff. But he also had a theory about religion, which is not quite so interesting or useful. His theory was that religion is just bad science. So David Hume was one of the first atheists who kind of got away with it. He lost a lot of jobs because people wouldn't hire him because he was an atheist. But he at least got to write about his atheism, and no one hung him or burned him at the stake. And he had this theory that ancient people weren't dumb. They just didn't have science. So they looked at the thunder and it was scary, so they decided some guy must be throwing lightning bolts, and that's where religion comes from. And as soon as we get smart, now we have science, we don't need religion anymore, and it will die out. It has clearly not died out. The world is more religious now than ever, and the fraction of religious people is actually growing, not in Europe and in the US, but worldwide. Religion is on the dramatic increase. The world is becoming more religious now than it ever has been in the past. Clearly, David Hume's theory was missing something because the prediction it made failed. I also think he's dramatically misunderstanding why the ancients told the stories they told. And he's talking about it in a very condescending way, which is, I just think, factually inaccurate. But this is kind of the beginning, and it was really some of the first breaks between theology and religious studies, even though his religious study was bad. Karl Marx is another one of those dramatically disproved theories of religion. His idea was that religion is the opiate of the masses. Clearly, he was antagonistic, right? He's not maintaining his objective, uninterested view. He's got an opinion. He's doing apologetics from the other side. Again, this has been dramatically disproved. If you go to the antebellum South, or went to the antebellum South right after the Civil War, and you started to ask African American people who had just been enslaved what their experience of religion was, what you find in the ethnographic data that we have, it's imperfect, I know, but if we look back on it and try to understand it, what we find is that the white slaveholders used religion exactly the way Karl Marx predicted that they would. Here we have theft of labor, and we have a bunch of white slaveholders who are using religion to try to keep their slaves in check. The black slaves, however, happily read the Exodus, and they weren't dumb, and they read the Exodus and they went, liberation theology, and clearly it did not work. The religion actually made them more likely to rebel. And that's exactly opposite of Karl Marx's hypothesis. Now, I want you to notice something about this hypothesis and the one before it. It may be wrong, kind of at broad strokes, but there's also some truth to it, in the sense that, right, the white slaveholders did try to use religion in the way Karl Marx predicted. This is going to be true of most of the theories we find, is that they're wrong in the broad sense, but often have insights in the narrow sense. And the problem was that they misapplied them too broadly. Not that they didn't have an insight, but they misapplied it far too broadly. And that will be true in most of these theories that we look at. There are insights here that are worth pulling out. William James was not antagonistic to religion. In fact, his pragmatism was a whole argument for why we should be religious. But for William James, religion was not the opiate of the masses. It was not bad science. It was an emotional response. He had religious experiences, so he wandered around and interviewed lots of different people and asked them about their religious experience. So for him, religion was psychology. So he applied psychological theories to religion, and the way he did that is he went around and he tried to catalog. He made a very dry, long catalog of all the religious experiences that he could find. And he specifically went and looked for the religious extremists, because in his opinion, the religious extremists had the most, dedicated and therefore the most deep experience of religion. So he wanted to find, the most ardent monks and the most, the people who had the visions, and he cataloged their religious feelings in a very lengthy book. And he says, the feeling is what religion is. Again, feelings are part of religion, but they are not all of religion. So for William James, because religion is an individual feeling, he missed the sociological impacts religion has, the society, the ability for religion to create communities. He completely missed that, because for him it was an individual experience. But he did a really good job of cataloging individual experiences that people felt were religious experiences. And he started the whole psychology view of religion. Emil Durkheim solved the problem that William James had, which was, for him, religion was all about sociology. He was a sociologist, of course, so for him, religion is sociology. He said, a religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden. So for him, what makes it religion is it's set apart, forbidden, has taboos around it. Beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. And so one of the things he was fond of saying is that religion is a way whereby people created symbols that allowed the people the society to reveal itself to itself. That's a really fancy way of saying sports logos. But for him, he was looking at anthropological studies in Australia, and he found that each of these tribes would have these sacred stones or something that would be like the symbol of their tribe, and that would create certain taboos around the words and stuff. So he cataloged all this stuff, and he thought that's what all religion was. But at least he recognized the way religion created communities that interlocked. Of course, everything he wrote about is clearly a part of human psychology, because we apply it very dramatically to our flags and to our sports logos. Those are our, sacred stone taboo thingies. And we have these taboos, like you can't let the flag touch the ground, and you can put people in jail if they burn it, some people want to be able to put people in jail if they burn it, whatever it is, because the symbol gathers sacred import to the community because it represents the community to itself. The problem with Durkheim, of course, is when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's also the problem that Freud had and all these others. Again, they're applying their theory too broadly. Instead of saying this is an insight into some aspects of religion, this is what religion is. They're reducing religion to a single thing. Sigmund Freud went back to psychology. For him, religion is like a neurosis. He used the word like very carefully in his first treatise, but then ignored it from then on out. So for him, religion was a neurosis. For him, neurosis were things, tell me about your mother, whatever. You had some sort of deep repressed thingamajig, usually had something to do with sex. I don't know why. And that created beliefs in things that were not real. And religion was a belief in something that wasn't real, probably because there was something weird going on with your mother. I don't know. And Sigmund Freud was messed up. On the other hand, and one of the things he noticed was OCD, right? OCD is this, and he noticed that religious ritual looked a lot like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Once you see that, by the way, you can't unsee it. Religious ritual does look a lot like OCD. So I'm going to propose an alternative theory. What if OCD is a spectrum and all human beings live on that spectrum? And if you're on the unhealthy side of that spectrum, it interferes with your life. And if you're on the healthy side, it forms structures that give your life structure and meaning. And religion speaks to those structures. And this is a good point to step in and say, can you see how you can apply that idea whether or not you believe in God? If you don't believe in God, then this explains why people do rituals. If you do believe in God, it explains why God has people do rituals, right? My point is, it doesn't matter. I don't want you to be afraid of this concept because we might discover through our study of religion inherent aspects of human nature. And it would make sense for any reasonable deity to speak to us in light of those elements of human nature. And so the result of this exploration doesn't have to be, again, atheism. I said that at the beginning, but this is a good place to illustrate that with an example, right? Maybe this explains why people perform ritual. And if it does, maybe that doesn't speak one way or the other about whether you're religious or non-religious. Gustav Carl Jung was a disciple of Freud's, but he broke over this concept of religion being all inherently evil. Gustav Jung, believed in the supernatural, liked to attend seances, that sort of thing. And he thought that religion was sometimes good for people, whereas Freud thought it was always bad. And if you just get rid of your neuroses, you'll stop believing in it, right? And Jung thought that's not true. In fact, he thought the subconscious was full of what he called the archetypes. And the way he discovered these archetypes is a comparative approach. He went around from religion to religion to religion and cataloged their religious imagery, their religious myths, and he found things that they had in common, and he defined them as archetypes that he thought had fundamental meaning to our subconscious. And he believed our subconscious struggled to express itself, and because it struggled to express itself, it expressed itself in images rather than words, and these images were the archetypes. We call this parallelomania today, and it's just it's the phenomenon where you see parallels where they don't always necessarily exist. You find two things that are vaguely similar, and you think you discovered, and this was the problem with most of my religious scholarship, for many years. Is I found all these theories and these parallels, and I thought I was discovering some ancient eternal truth buried in the data, and right. And I was making stuff up. But you see parallels, and minds like to find parallels. In statistics, we call this overfit. But Carl Jung was kind of guilty of overfit. That being said, he's not wrong that there are similar themes that all religions have. I may not agree with his concept of the archetypes, but he's finding that religions are similar everywhere. We can ask questions about that now. So I'm kind of doing some of the old stuff, but I'm also kind of bringing in some of the newer questions we might ask. Why are religions all around the world similar? There are two hypotheses. The first is religions spread as humans moved out of Africa, etc. They spread out like a family tree, and because they have a common root, their similarities grow from that root. The counter evidence we have for that are what we would call in biological theory convergent evolution, where we see two religions who don't have things in common, who over time grow to have things in common. When we see things like that, we start to believe that there's something inherent in human psychology that causes us to discover similar themes. And those similar themes might be related to his archetypes. He was certainly good at finding common themes. He's overselling it, is what I would say. But he's not wrong that there are these common themes throughout religion, and reading his discussion of those common themes is fascinating reading and useful and interesting stuff. Clifford Geertz is a more modern approach. He says religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, persuasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. I don't know why they make these things so wordy, but nevertheless, there it is. And what he's basically saying is this is a more sophisticated definition. Religion is a cultural set of symbols and moods and systems. That systems can do a lot of work because it can be any number of things, right? It could be a church. It can be a set of rituals like baptism. It could be a set of norms like thou shalt not kill, etc. And all these systems establish powerful, persuasive, long-lasting moods. That incorporates William James's emotions that come along with religions, but also motivations. Why do people do the things they do? You see, he sees it's like this definition is better than the others because it incorporates pieces from the ones that came before and tries to put them together into kind of a more holistic thing. Richard Dawkins is fun. I don't know how many of you have read The God Delusion, but here's a man who's very convinced that the problem the world has is religion. If we could just get everyone to stop being religious, we'd solve all the world's problems. He misunderstands the fact that his own dogmatism is exactly part of why we have problems, because it makes it so we don't get along with each other. I would say the world's problems have to do with the fact that we don't get along, and if we would get together and talk, we might get along more, like we are doing here. And so I think that's a misdiagnosis of the human problem. But he has a theory of what religion is, and of course he's a biologist. So his theory is, and bear with me for a second because there's something to this. His theory is that religion is a mimetic virus. His most famous book is The Selfish Gene, so he's a gene theorist. And he actually coined the term meme. You know what a meme is? Social media meme, right? Something that goes viral on social media is a meme. Well, a meme is like a gene. It's something that we inherit from the ideas before us. It's an idea. It's an idea gene. We inherit it from the things before. We pass it forward, but when we do, it mutates slightly. And the ideas that are more convincing survive better. So religions evolve, and the ones that are more compelling survive better. But for him, it's a mimetic virus because it just makes us do irrational things like fly airplanes into buildings. So that's bad for humanity. It's a virus. We need to get rid of it. We need better immune systems to keep us from believing these nonsensical things. But it's hard to do because the most compelling of these viruses are the ones that survive. That's why our religions tell compelling stories. Could I do something like what I did before with Freud and propose an alternative that is less antagonistic? What if it's a mimetic symbiote instead of a virus? Because religion does sometimes help people and societies form, correlate, get together, talk to each other. Sometimes we fly airplanes into buildings in the name of these memes. Sometimes we all kill ourselves like Heaven's Gate cults. But sometimes we get together and we help the poor, and we love each other, and we care for each other, and we do all sorts of service, and our communities better cohere because we have in-groups and we work together within our coherent communities. In that sense, religion could be not just a virus, but a symbiote, right? Something that if it helps its host survive, maybe is more likely to spread. Right? The difference between a virus likes to kill its host, And a symbiote likes to make sure its host survives because that helps the symbiote's own survival. So if we have religions that make our lives better, maybe we're more likely to share them and therefore make the lives of other people around us better. So there's no reason to assume that they're solely viral. But again, this could be true whether or not there is a God or even whether or not there is a true religion, because we know when we look at the world's history of religions that they do evolve this way. You can track an evolutionary tree, and you can use evolutionary theory to track the evolutions. You can catalog all the world's myths, for example, and you can look at where mutations happen, and you can say, well, these share this common mutation, and these share this common mutation, so those probably have a common ancestor. And you can try to rebuild the tree of common ancestors as you work your way back. And when you do that, some people claim that it roughly tracks with human genetic dispersal. And so we know now, again, I find that thesis is controversial, but I've seen people try to do it, and they just kind of apply the same computer algorithms we use to create family trees of our own genetic ancestors. And this thing falls out, and it looks an awful lot like. But again, that's a controversial, recent, sort of take. But either way, I don't know how seriously to take that, but I'm pretty sure that religions do evolve. I've watched, my own past religion evolve over time, and I'm pretty sure they evolve by having ideas that spread. People have the best ideas, those spread. You can ask the question of whether God is involved in that or whether he's not. Again, I think that this shouldn't be a challenge to your faith if you have a faith, but it is clearly an aspect of how religions are created in the world and how they evolve and how they survive, is that they're ideas that spread in our minds and spread from our minds to other people's minds, and each time they do that, they mutate a little bit, and the best of them survive. There's some truth to that. Jonathan Haidt is he's a psychologist, but he's a positive psychologist. He wrote a book called The Happiness Hypothesis that's really good. He also wrote a great book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Everyone in the world should read this book because I'm nosy that way and pushy. But I all think you should all read this book. It's amazing. And he argues that religion can often serve a purpose. Basically, he's arguing that religion is a mimetic symbiote rather than a mimetic parasite, and that it has psychological benefits to the various people who hold those religious beliefs. On the other hand, let me think if I can formalize his thesis a little bit better. This is one of the more modern theses that I find very compelling. He argues that we evolved in groups that were tribal, and religion is one of the things that cohered different tribes to each other. And that explains why we get along very well with our own tribe, but it also explains why getting along with other tribes is difficult. In other words, it tells you why the work we're doing here today in this group is so hard, but on the other hand, why it's so important to get together and talk about stuff that we may disagree with each other on, sometimes profoundly. And that profound disagreement is okay. But that's hard because our evolution kind of primed us to cooperate very strongly with our own individual tribe and group, but to compete with outside tribes. And so that's why religion both binds us together, but also sometimes divides us. It's why we fly airplanes into buildings. But it's also why we get together and have a soup kitchen. And I think it's a very compelling kind of psychological theory that deals with both the problems and the benefits that religion can provide. So this is one of the ones I'm a fan of. There's a whole other approach to religious studies. This one's fun because, again, I like polling and statistics, and I happen to like politics, so I also especially the polling involved with politics because it scratches my statistical itch. Right? How do you combine polls correctly, and how do you properly assign uncertainty to them? Because the uncertainty is always bigger than the sample size. You get these polls and they'll tell you the margin of error. You need to at least triple that every time you get a poll. And the reason is because the margin of error tells you what you would expect if you had an unbiased sample of that size. The problem is there are other errors in the poll, like certain classes of people don't answer the phone. And so you have to correct for that. And when you correct for that, you introduce correlated errors that the margin of error does not account for. So all of this is very interesting to me, but there's a whole field of religious studies that tries to apply this. Two really good books on this are Jana Rice, The Next Mormons, and Ryan Berg, The Nuns. And both of them are just taking statistical data and asking what the implications are. What does this say about, the leaders of a church may tell you what you're supposed to believe when you belong to that church. That's especially true of the Mormons. But The Next Mormons is a survey of millennial Mormons, and what she's basically showing is they don't believe what the leaders of the church are telling them to believe. At least a large fraction of them don't. That's very interesting data. What she did that I found especially compelling was she collected the data herself. She went through great hoops to make sure it was an unbiased sample. It's not, but it's as good as you can get. And then she did one-on-one qualitative surveys with individual people, where she has this broad statistical data, but then she talks to people and says, what does this mean in your life? And she combines the two. So she tells the statistical story, and then she tells a personal story of a specific person who feels this way and why they feel that way. And then she shows more statistical data, and then she shares another specific story from an individual. Very compelling method of research, very enlightening in terms of understanding this particular movement among a very specific religious group. This is the sort of thing I think that if you want to do religious studies, like this is the sort of, if I were to quit my job and go get a degree in religious studies, this is the sort of research I'd want to do, because I find it very compelling and enlightening and useful all at the same time. Ryan Berg is not doing quite that same thing. He's just got a whole bunch of statistical data, but he did write a book trying to explain why so many people mark none of the above on surveys. So for him, the nuns are the people who say none of the above when you ask them what religion are you. And that class of survey data has grown. And so what he did is he compared many different surveys over time, and he started looking at crosstabs. Crosstabs are like, age and what religion were you before you became a nun, or what was your socioeconomic status? And he starts to ask questions about what group of people are more likely to lose their religious belief, in the sense of, in the past they may have marked Methodist and now they mark none. What happened to them? And he's very interesting conclusions come out of it. He's also a political scientist, so he's interested in the political implications, especially among white evangelicals, and it has all sorts of interesting things to say for the rise of the religious right and things like that. So again, very fascinating book. I highly recommend both of these. This is what I do when I define religion for my comparative religion classes. We're not going to read all this, but Ninian Smart says there are seven dimensions of religion. So imagine an n-dimensional space with 7 vectors, 7 base vectors. I know some of you can do that. I can't. But what he's basically saying is you can mark each religion on this plot versus how interested are they in ritual, narrative and mythic elements, experiential, emotional elements, social and institutional elements, ethical and legal elements, doctrinal and philosophical elements, and material elements. And each religion will score kind of differently on each of those categories. And when you have an organization that scores high on all of them, that's a religion. When you have something that scores low on all of them, that's not a religion. And then he points out that most religions in the world will score high on some and low on others. The advantage of this is it recognizes the fuzzy boundary between a religion and a non-religion, and it lets you ask questions like if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck. For my purposes, it is a duck. If it doesn't walk like a duck and talk like a duck, it's not. If it's a platypus, then I don't know. And I love this because I think it captures a lot of the real complexity, as a definition at least. I love this. It captures the complexity. So I will admit, and it also speaks to my machine learning statistical mind, except I'm trying to picture this in 7 dimensions, but let's assume I've plopped it down to 2, and I can say something like, I don't know if you can see my mouse. No, you can't. You can see it on my screen and not that screen. Let me come over here. But something like, these are religions, these are social clubs, and these are non-religious institutions, something like that. And I'm just basically saying, hey, is it got a lot of myths that it likes to tell? Has it got a lot of rituals? Then it scores high in the is it a religion score. Okay, now a lot of that has had to do with definitions. I know that, and it's frustrating because when I looked at teaching this, there was so much I wanted to discuss in so little time, and I'm already over time. And I tried to cut a whole bunch of stuff, and I didn't know what to talk about. And it's hard to go anywhere without doing the definitions first, but that takes the whole time, and then I don't get to talk about all the interesting theories you can have about, anyway. I want to talk about one issue, though, because it's the most important, and that is reductionism versus holism. The problem with most of those theories that we mentioned before is religion is just an economic oppression. Religion is just a neurosis. It's reductionism. And the problem is that religion is this complex combination of all of them. And so one approach to solving that problem was Eliade. He did something very similar to Carl Jung, and he was doing a comparative religion, and he suffered from parallelomania, but he found similarities between lots of religions. But what he was trying to do was to solve reductionism, and the way he was trying to solve it was he proposed that there was something real in the world. And there's the holy, the sacred, is a real thing that breaks through. And so he said, assuming it's real, we can study it by asking people what they do when they encounter it. And that's why he was doing comparative religion. And he came up with ideas like the sacred center. When sacredness, holiness breaks through, that becomes the center, and you mark your camp around that center, and you have taboos, and he created this long list of things that people do when they encounter the holy. This has been controversial, to say the least, because for believers, they're like, well, do you really believe that the holy that an Aboriginal tribe in Australia is experiencing is real? Because this is what he's assuming. So that's problematic for believers. It's also very problematic for non-believers, obviously, who don't think that the sacred exists. For them, it's a psychological phenomenon. Kind of what I want to propose is that there's another way to think about what he was doing, and that's how I'm going to end. And that is, what if we think about religion as an emergent phenomenon at its own level? Sean Carroll talks about affective theories. I don't think he coined the term, but he's the one who brought that idea to my mind, where he says we can have an affective theory of chemistry, where we talk about empty shells and the desire for electrons, to be shared and to fill those empty shells, and that's why certain things react and other things don't. It's all just quantum mechanics. But if I have to explain chemistry in terms of quantum mechanics, I don't get very far. And so it's useful to have an effective theory at a higher level. And in this case, that higher level is chemistry. And then I can have molecular biology, and I can build levels on top of each of these levels, all the way down to sociology, psychology, physiology, cell biology, molecular biology. Each of those levels build on the one before it. So what if religion is its own thing? Like, what if we study it as its own thing that is real? Not because necessarily the holy is always real, but because religion is a real thing. It may be a fuzzy thing. It may have boundaries, and it may be very difficult for us to differentiate between a religious and a secular institution and all that stuff. But there's psychological things going on here that when we study them, we learn more about what it means to be human. It should be very important to us. But there's some real thing out there in the world which we call religion, and yes, it may emerge from earlier fundamental aspects of biology and neuroscience and philosophy and psychology. But it's a complex thing that merged all of those together. And yes, there may even be a real sacred holy thing out there that's a part of that mix. But it is this complex merger of all of those elements. And therefore, it has to be studied at its own level instead of saying it is just the opiate of the masses or it is just something else. And so this is how I think of religion, is as an emergent phenomenon that comes from other underlying aspects. And each of these earlier researchers, I think, kind of uncovered parts of those aspects. But it's when you put them together that you start to see a bigger, broader picture of what religion is. And once you do that, then you can start doing the real research, which of course we didn't get to talk about. Right? What would be really interesting is to go take a religious studies journal and start showing you what sorts of things, what questions people are asking and what methods they're using to try to answer those questions, because that's where it gets exciting. But you can't do that, I think, effectively until you've seen the past, the beginning, which is why I titled this kind of an introduction to religious studies. If you want more, I did this in an hour. I was supposed to do it in a half hour. I apologize. This guy will do it in about, I think, 12 hours, 13 hours, something like that. Each of the people I discussed, he has a half-hour lecture on. This I highly recommend. So if anything I said is interesting to you, what I really did is a 1-hour distillation of this course with some extra stuff that I find interesting added on. But I highly recommend Professor Charles B. Jones, great courses, Introduction to the Study of Religion. It's basically a religious studies introduction college-level course that you can just sit and listen to on your way to and from work, by playing it on your car stereo or something, which is of course what I did. Are there any? Thank you for having me. Are there any burning questions or thoughts or?
Okay, here's a microphone. Anybody with questions?
This is where it's going to get hard, right? Because now you get to grill me,
Here you go.
and I may not know the answer.
Thank you very much, James. That was fascinating. And I really appreciate your erudition and how widely read and thoughtful you are. If we observe humans all around the world, we see that they all speak language. We see that they all use fire. And we see that they all practice religion. And I'm talking about simple societies, hunter-gatherer groups, but also more complex societies. I'm struck as I listen to these theorists of religion that it is as if we asked someone whose only experience of language was that he had been insulted all his life to explain why humans do language, or someone whose only experience with fire was that he had been burned repeatedly to explain why humans all over use fire. It is as if we are asking people like that to explain why people do religion all over. And you touched on numerous examples, I would say, of...
That's clearly true of Marx and Freud. Not true of William James.
Yes, or Eliade,
Right.
very much appreciate those two. I guess my question is, why do you suppose we have given so much credence and attention to those who've been repeatedly burned and repeatedly insulted, metaphorically?
That's a good question. I don't think those are the only voices we should listen to, obviously. I think both of them, especially the two biggest ones, Freud and Marx, had very interesting things to say. I think that's one of the reasons they get so much credit. On the other hand, they were clearly wrong, at least in the broad strokes, when it comes to religion. I don't know why we give them so much more credit than some of the other theorists of religion. And I think maybe you're right, that's a mistake.
They were eloquent.
They were certainly eloquent,
And
they were also brilliant, right?
Real smart, yeah, and eloquent.
We may disagree with people, but that doesn't mean they weren't smart and brilliant, and smarter than I am. I also want to kind of have my own little moment of humility that this is, I see further than those who came before me because I stand on the shoulders of giants. And so when I can kind of casually take the words of a very brilliant man and say, well, he was wrong, it's the same thing I would do if I was in front of Newton. He was wrong because Einstein showed us that he was wrong. He was also brilliant, and Einstein wouldn't have done what he did if Newton hadn't come before him. I think I know more than they do, but only because I lived after them, and I stand on their shoulders. So anyway.
Question?
I hopefully learned from their mistakes.
Any more questions? Comments?
Jeremy. Now I'm scared.
I'm going to lob you a softball. How can two different communities talk to each other when one of them is so clearly wrong?
That's not a softball. Okay, so the first thing I think to realize is that everybody thinks it's the other community that's wrong. and that they're right. And that doesn't mean I'm not right and they're wrong, right? I'm not telling you you can't hold your conviction strongly. Because I think I'm right. That's why I believe the things I believe. But I have some history of once believing something different strongly. So if you know my background, I belong to a different religious denomination, and I switched religious denominations midstream in my life. And I thought I was right before, and I was manifestly wrong. I think I'm right now. I'm probably also manifestly wrong in different ways. But I think the biggest insight, and we really need to learn this in our politics, is that often the people we think are not only wrong but kind of immoral think the same thing about us. And it's not because, now sometimes they are, right? But it's not because, normally it's not just because they are immoral monsters. They have a different moral framework than we do. And the academic study of that is sometimes useful. And so it changes how you try to change their mind as well. My debate teacher, Ms. Gregg, I've tried to look her up. She quit teaching right as I started trying to look her up, and therefore I can't find her email. I wanted to tell her what she did for me. But she was trying to convince me to argue. I was in a debate class, and I had to argue for abortion. And at the time I was anti-abortion, and I said, why would you make me do this? It's immoral. Why would I ever argue for an immoral stance? And she said, if you want to change someone's mind, you need to understand their position better than they do, to the point where you could make their arguments better than they can, and then you have a hope of changing their mind. And so in my zealotry to change people's mind, I began to seriously study the other side's position in a way that otherwise my confirmation bias would not have let me do. And when I did, I began to change my own views. Not just about that, but about everything, because I realized that the truth was actually somewhere closer to the middle, because they had a point. I don't agree with it everywhere, but at least once you understand their point so well that you can change their mind, you sometimes realize they had a point. I'm not suggesting that's the solution to everything, but we are not going to, we have to live in this world together. We either find a way to live together or we shoot each other. And from my perspective, that last is unacceptable. And so I have to find a way to live with people who believe dramatically different things from me, even some things that I think are immoral, because I want them to do the same for me. And so I start with that conversation before I start with the trying to change people's minds, right? Is that it doesn't matter what you believe, we've got to find a way to live together. No matter what we believe. And again, if you, I'm going to just make recommendations, right? Go read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, because he's going to do a better job of explaining this than I am. But
that's a great point. The Righteous Mind is wonderful on this point. The way I look at it is we are so tribal. Part of tribalness is excluding any explanation given by another tribe. And the full title of his book is The Righteous Mind, Why Religion, why people of religion,
why good people are divided by politics and religion.
Yeah, so it applies to both religion and politics, and both very strongly, particularly politics, particularly now.
And the fact, by the way, that you're here and listening to me say things that some of you are probably going to disagree with, is part. You're halfway there, right? I mean, this is what it takes. Is we have to be here and listen to each other and talk to each other. What I haven't figured out is how do we get along in society with groups who don't want to get along with us. That's harder, and I don't know the answer to that.
You asked for questions. My question is, do you allow a comment rather than a question?
Of course.
All right.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
I'm reminded I had two pretty difficult master's degree projects and PhD projects, and I had two very different advisors. But my last advisor, at a conference, they'd ask for questions, and he would stand up and give a lecture. But so anyway, my comment is I think the real problem, or a problem, okay, is syncretism. And I'll give you an example. When I read my English translation of the Quran, okay, I see a lot of agreements with the Bible. They put forth the virgin birth, and there are a number of things that where the Quran definitely agrees with the Bible, but then later on it says, well, Jesus is not the Son of God. It's an abomination for you to say that. So that's syncretism. And that's a major problem as far as I'm concerned. But that's all I had to say.
I would love to discuss that.
Example of that, syncretism.
I'd love to discuss that more, right? It says I don't. Syncretism usually is understood as when religions, Unitarian Universalists are the world's master syncretists. But when you combine your beliefs with many others, and when one of the things that religious studies has shown us is when two different religious groups come together, what comes out of that is often a merger of beliefs in theory and culture. And so that's sort of a natural process of religion. It can have problems. And certainly if you believe in some pure religious belief that has to be preserved, that's a very big problem. But it can also be a great source of coming together if you're willing to allow your religion to merge with the good ideas of the people around you and kind of incorporate all the good ideas and hopefully throw away the bad ones. Yeah.
I just have one, since I'm a strong believer in the Trinity, I naturally have problems with that business in the Quran. That syncretism really blows me off. So, all right, I've said enough, I guess.
No, it's fine. I mean, like I said, if you have a belief that you believe is pure and true, then when it's corrupted by contact with other religious traditions, that can be a problem for that belief. It makes perfect sense to me. There's nothing wrong with that position. I'm just trying to understand it and discuss it. Bob.
James, thanks for truly inspiring and wonderful lecture. Appreciate that. When you were answering questions earlier, you made a passing comment that said, one group will always name the other one as wrong. You were talking about being wrong and naming. Is it absolutely necessary for constructive dialogue to be able to name the error
No.
on the part of the other party?
No, and it's not always true that every time I get together with another group, it doesn't mean everything they say is wrong. And so let me take my statement back. You're right, I was wrong to say it that way. Let me say it a little differently, though. If I believed that the other group was more right or in line with how I wanted to be than mine, I would belong to it. And so what I was hoping is that we would each recognize that we have that sense that our belief, our position is superior to the other in some way, but they believe that same thing too. And so the trick with ecumenism is to find a way to get along with that group. So, for example, if you have a strong belief in the Trinity, I'm not going to tell you that's wrong. I just hope you can get along with a Unitarian who doesn't. And we can be friends. But I don't expect you to change your mind. And by the way, I actually think that the Trinity is probably the best interpretation of the biblical text as we have it. So that's weird for a Unitarian to say, right? But
Yeah, I was thinking, the group that I was thinking of was Braver Angels. And in Francis Collins' book, The Road to Wisdom, he talks about these exact issues, coming from a scientific perspective, the strong conservative polarization against science, against vaccinations, against all of this. How do you deal with it? Where is this coming from? And he treats it in a very good way, I think. So people on both conservative and liberal sides will be willing to read it. So I would highly recommend that book too, Francis Collins' Road to Wisdom.
that's one I haven't read, so I'll have to go look.
The other thing I've noticed is, I forget which book I read it in, is when the Civil War was coming up, the Secretary of State recommended to Lincoln, You know, there's a way you can stop this civil war from coming. You can declare war on France or Great Britain. It makes no difference. And then when the country comes behind it, it will bring the country back together again. So it seems that due to the split that we have in the country, it takes a binding force greater than the division to bring us back together again. Anyway, that's my 2 cents
Common
worth.
enemies are psychologically very good tools for doing that.
Yeah,
Doesn't mean it's a good thing for society, but it does mean that it works,
yeah.
unfortunately, perhaps.
Lincoln didn't go along with it. So anyway,
Yeah.
Oh, man, that's too bad.
yeah. So,
All right.
any other
questions
questions?
or
Yeah.
comments?
All right. Well, let's thank our speaker again, James. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.